professor in archaeology and head of the Department of Anthropology and Archaeology at Harvard University. His research interests include the archaeology of the Southwest US, collaborative archaeology, the archaeology of colonialism, and postcolonialism. He has conducted collaborative research with the Pueblo of Germs since 2001, and also served as tribal archaeologist and NAGPRA program director at the Germs Department of Natural Resources. Today, he will be presenting on Stalked by the Refuse Wind, Colonialism, Disease, and Structural Violence Among the Pueblos, 1540 to 2021. This meeting will be recorded, and also for the Q&A afterwards, as usual, please send in your questions via the chat or use the hand raise button. And I will now pass on to Dr. Liebmann. The stage is all yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks to Kim and Saltanat and Paul for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here and see some familiar names in the crowd. I want to begin today by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the traditional homelands of the Massachusetts people. You may have noticed here that the title of this talk is slightly different from the one that was advertised. As I was pulling this talk together over the past few days, I started to grow increasingly uncomfortable with the notion of situating my work within an explicit framework of decolonization. Not that I don't support the incredibly important work of decolonization in archaeology, I truly and wholeheartedly do, but I don't want to co-opt the discourse of decolonization for my own benefit. As Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang have noted in their iconic article of the same name, decolonization is not just a metaphor. And at the end of the day, I am a settler colonist who has benefited both directly and indirectly from the erasure and assimilation of indigenous peoples. That's just a fact. So it would be wrong of me to appropriate the language and work of decolonization for my own ends. In fact, I think I'd be perpetuating colonial exploitation if I were to co-opt the framework of decolonization to characterize my work. So I hope it's okay with you if I give a slightly different talk than the one I had advertised, still on my work in the Southwest, still on a community-based project with my collaborators at Jemez Pueblo in New Mexico. But rather than the title I gave, instead I'm going to speak about colonialism, disease, and structural violence in the American Southwest. So I want to begin today with a question, and that is, how many people lived in the Americas in 1492? Now, this is an issue that has been hotly debated by historians, archaeologists, demographers, anthropologists, and indigenous intellectuals for more than a century now. And the amazing thing about this question is that we all look at generally the same bodies of data, but yet we manage to reach radically different conclusions about this question. On one end of the spectrum, conservative estimates would speculate that around 8 million people lived in the Western Hemisphere in 1492. And today, advocates of this position are known as the low counters, and their views contrast with those who speculate populations larger by more than an order of magnitude, and up to 112 million people living in the Americas in 1492. Now, these theories are promoted by a group known as the high counters, and they really emerged in the 1960s among scholars who were speculating that larger numbers of indigenous peoples in the Americas were wiped out than had previously been recognized, based on the notion that waves of pandemic disease swept up from central Mexico and throughout the Americas, often ahead of first contacts with Europeans, or at least first documented contacts with Europeans. And it's also based on the notion that Native Americans were genetically vulnerable to these old world diseases. I'm sure this is an argument with which many of you are familiar. Now, historians have challenged the utility of even asking the question, how many people were living in the Americas? And so in a 1998 book, the historian David Hennig declared all of these estimates to be, quote, forlorn attempts to answer a thoroughly unanswerable question. Now, despite Hennig's title, I would argue the numbers do not come from nowhere. They are derived, like a lot of historical data, from difficult and problematic sources that include incomplete records, the bias of the authors, unrepresented populations. But even if we were to throw out the written records entirely, there's still a plethora of data that are available to answer this question. In fact, and I'm preaching to the choir here, I know, answering the questions that documents can't easily answer is what archaeologists do. I'm not as pessimistic as Hennig would be, but we can ask ourselves, what does it matter? Why should we care? Does it really make a difference if the number was 8 million people versus 20 million people versus 112 million people in the Americas? Well, I would argue that this difference is significant, that it can radically change our understandings of world history. So from the Native American perspective, we can ask if this loss of population could properly be termed a genocide or not. This revolves around questions of how intentional was the depopulation that occurred. Henry Dobbins, an ethnohistorian, estimated that between 90 and 112 million people were living in the Americas in 1491. And if Dobbins' estimate is accurate, more people would have been living in the Americas than in Europe at that time. And also, if Dobbins is correct, then the destruction that was wrought by old world diseases in the 16th and 17th centuries would have killed 1 in every 5 people on Earth at this time. And this would be the greatest destruction of human life in world history. Now, then too, there are legal questions surrounding European laws of conquest that allowed for the taking of terra nullius and play into notions of manifest destiny. Were American lands heavily populated by indigenous peoples prior to European contact, or were they vacant and empty for the taking? For archaeologists, this has implications for our use of ethnographic analogy. If the high counters are correct, then the earliest written records of Europeans record a world that has already been vastly changed from the one that prehistorians often attempt to study. So projecting analogies based on the earliest written records would result in a fundamentally flawed understanding of the past, because the notion being that the population at the time those records were written was already severely reduced from the pre-contact population base. Now, in recent years, this issue of Native American population has extended into debates regarding the existence of the Anthropocene. Ever since this term was coined 15 years ago, geologists have debated when humans first left a clear mark in the geological record. In other words, when does the Anthropocene begin? And the commonly suggested starting points include 1784 with the invention of the steam engine and the dawn of the Industrial Revolution and the resulting increase in the use of fossil fuels. Others have suggested that 1945 is a more appropriate starting date, marking our entrance into the atomic age with the first atomic bomb blast at Alamogordo, New Mexico. But over the past few years, some of our colleagues at UCL, Simon Lewis and Mark Maslin and their collaborators, have proposed a previously unconsidered start date for the Anthropocene. And they advocated a date of 1610. So this date might seem strange for those unfamiliar with this scholarship. Why 1610? Well, when they examined a set of Arctic ice cores to reconstruct atmospheric trends in carbon dioxide, they found that 1610 represented the lowest concentration of global atmospheric CO2 in the past 1,000 years. And so this gray line that you see here represents CO2 in parts per million as found in Antarctic ice cores, and it shows this drop, sorry about that, starting in 1580 and bottoming out at around 1610. The gray line on the bottom shows terrestrial carbon uptake coinciding at the same time. And so Lewis and Maslin link this drop in CO2 to the death of millions of Native Americans in the first century after European contact. Why would the decline in Native American populations cause a drop in CO2 on a global scale? Well, they theorized that native depopulation led to a decline in farming and in the use of fire to manage the landscape. And this simultaneously caused a decrease in the burning of forested landscapes, along with the simultaneous regrowth of forests, both of which would have resulted in the removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. Now, this theory is based largely on data from the Amazon basin and neotropical climates in the Americas, where the archaeological estimates of population are largely theoretical and are derived from data based on the carrying capacity of the region. And so those estimates were based on potential population rather than demographic estimates based on archaeological remains. So in order to assess this theory further, we need to look at places that have a robust archaeological record, complemented by robust studies of forest ecology. And so my colleagues and I took this question on in the Southwestern US. For those of you who are not up on your US geography, the state that you see in red here is the state of New Mexico. New Mexico is in fact a state. It is not part of Mexico, the country. Americans themselves are sometimes confused about that. You can see here it's located between the states of Texas and Arizona. Northern New Mexico is the home of the Pueblo tribes, indigenous peoples of New Mexico. You see on this map the 19 Pueblos of New Mexico. Slightly off of this map in northern Arizona would be the Hopi Pueblos. And so each one of these names that you see listed on this map in black represents an individual Pueblo tribe. Today, their populations range from around 300 to some of the tribes north of Santa Fe to 7,000 out here at Zuni. And among the Pueblo tribes today, there are 6 different languages that are still spoken among them. My work takes place with Jemez Pueblo. Whoops, my cursor's not, oh, sorry about that. My cursor's not working. Out here on the western portion of the Pueblos. The city of Albuquerque is located between Sandia and Isleta down here. This area is most famous today because it plays a huge role in the TV show Breaking Bad. So for any of you who are fans of Breaking Bad, this is where they go to cook the meth in the early episodes of Breaking Bad. So we decided to tackle this question of population and forest ecology along with our partners from the Pueblo of Jemez. So our research team consisted of folks from Jemez Pueblo, myself, some of my colleagues from the University of Arizona and Southern Methodist University. Pictured here are members of the Cultural Resource Advisory Team, and these gentlemen helped us to identify appropriate research questions and to devise the appropriate methods of investigation. Particularly important to the tribe was looking into ways to better manage their forested lands. As many of you may be aware, excuse me, wildfires are increasingly problematic in the American West, particularly with the climate change that we're enduring. And so one of the questions that the Pueblo wanted to address was to look at the ways their ancestors had managed fire in the past and the lessons that could be drawn from the past to help them more effectively manage their forested tribal lands today. So we also collected data alongside tribal members, and they collaborated with us in the interpretation of that data, as well as the publication of much of this data, and helped me to put together this presentation. So I want to acknowledge all the tribal members that participated in this project. Here you see my friend Aaron Tosa collecting some of the data that we used on this project, and to mention that they have okayed the presentation of this data in these educational contexts, such as I'm doing here today, and I thank them for that. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the climate of northern New Mexico, it's a high desert climate, and you're looking up the Jemez Valley here, and in pre-contact times, Jemez people lived in more than 35 large Pueblo villages that were built on the tops of these mesas surrounding this canyon. So you see here a reconstruction of one of those villages. They ranged from hundreds to thousands of rooms, and populations ranged from as few as probably about 50 people up to this large Pueblo, which is known as Seychukwa, which probably housed around 1,300 people. Now, this reconstruction is incorrect in one major way, and that is that the mesa tops around these villages would have been nearly completely denuded at the time that they were occupied. So it does get pretty cold up here in the winter, a couple feet of snow. And so all the trees would have been cut for use in the architecture of these villages, as well as for heating and cooking. And so I'm going to come back to this later in the talk here. Now, the earliest contacts between peoples from the Old World and the Pueblos occurred in 1539. There were sporadic contacts throughout the remainder of the 16th century, and permanent colonization took place beginning in 1598. We think that around the time of earliest contacts, there were an estimated about 80 to 100 different Pueblos, and that over the course of the first 100 years of contact, that number was reduced by more than half, down to about 46 that you see here. Now, this settlement pattern data would possibly indicate the decline in population as might be expected. However, it's not entirely clear, because we do have other moments of Pueblo history in which we see the total number of sites declining even as populations actually rose in prehistoric times, because we have aggregation at some of the larger settlement sites. So the settlement pattern data alone doesn't tell us actually whether the population is increasing or decreasing. So in order to attack that question, we wanted to look in the Jemez region, which is depicted up here on this map. You can see it's reduced from about 18 Pueblos immediately prior to contact down to one Pueblo today. And this is Jemez Pueblo in the southern end of the valley. But again, in the pre-contact times, they were living on the tops of these mesas in this red area to the north of the village. So our job was to try to figure out how many people were living up here on the mesa tops immediately before European contact. Now, we started by looking at the historical documents, and the Spaniards give us a wide variety of population estimates at this time. The first one is a guy who wanders into this valley, spends less than 24 hours, and tells us that 30,000 people live there. You can see it's a large number, it's a round number, and I don't think we can put a whole lot of credence in it. But over the course of the 17th century, we get a couple of other population estimates, which have a huge range of variation. An incredibly precise estimate here in 1622, and then 8 years later, less than half of that. So the first time when we really can, I think, have a great deal of confidence in the population estimates that we get from documents happens after the Pueblo Revolt, which is a incredible native insurrection that takes place in 1680s, one of the most successful uprisings in the history of American colonialism. And when Spaniards return after that, we get demographic data indicating there are less than 900 people living in the Jemez Valley at that time. And this is corroborated by the archaeological data from that period as well. So we can hang our hat on this 900 number. As to what's going on before that, it is still an open question. And so to try to answer that question, what we did was we first went out and identified all the sites that would have been occupied between 1492 and 1540. We're lucky to have a really tight ceramic chronology in this region of the US, as well as the aid of dendrochronological data. So we have tree rings that help us really accurately date these sites. And we were able to identify 18 villages that were occupied on the eve of first contact with Europeans. Just to give you an indication of what those sites look like today, this is the ancestral Jemez village of Coastiuqua. What you see here is it's a stone masonry village. So you're seeing the collapsed stone masonry in these apartment style room blocks that you see here. You can see some circular depressions. These are kivas, or the subterranean ceremonial chambers that Pueblo people still use for much of their religious practice today. So the task was to figure out how many people were living at these 18 villages at the time of, or around the time of initial contact. And we were aided in this by a LiDAR flight, which was done by the United States Forest Service. And so we got this great LiDAR data, which allowed us to measure the architectural volume of these sites. So we were able to put this into a GIS and calculate the volume of the rubble that allowed us to come up with, I think, is a pretty accurate determination of the floor area that was occupied in these villages. But of course, we have the problem that archaeologists face here. It is a palimpsest. These sites were occupied for centuries, sometimes up to more than 500 years. So we have to account for the fact that not every room would have been occupied at the same time. And then also we had to figure out what the measurements of rubble and subsequently floor area really mean. How many people did a square meter of floor area actually represent? So any of you who have worked on archaeological estimates know that these are all over the place. And you can get people who will tell you anywhere from 3 square meters per person to 10 square meters per person, which give us estimates that were so wide as to be really no better than those that the Spaniards produced at this time. But we had another incredible stroke of luck because we had access to a data site, data from a site known as Old Cochiti. This was a site that was studied by my PhD advisor, Bob Purcell from Brown University. And this is a site that is unique in the Southwest in that it's a Pueblo village that was built, occupied, and abandoned in less than 14 years. So we have both the initiation date and the abandonment date. So 14 years, no palimpsest effect here. We know that every room is occupied when this village is built. It was mapped using modern techniques by Bob and his crew in the late 1990s. So we have an accurate measurement of the floor area down to the centimeter. And we have historical records from the Spaniards that report the population that were living at this village. So it's a unique village in that it was 100% occupied, 100% excavated, and we have the recorded population of the village. And that allowed us to come up with an accurate estimate of the floor area used per person during this period. It happens to come out to 5.57 meters per person, but I think that's specific to the Pueblos in the 17th century, and I think that would differ in other contexts. So now that we established that number, we can look at all 18 of those villages and try and come up with population estimates. So when we apply the number of persons per square meter, we get a hypothetical population that comes out to just under 10,000 people. So the maximum population would have been 9,903. Now, this assumes that every square meter of every room was occupied at the same time. Again, doesn't take into account that palimpsest effect. So based on a lot of work by a lot of other archaeologists in the Southwest, we decided to not use the maximum number, but instead use a range. And if we assume 50% occupation of these villages, that gives us a number of just below 5,000 people, 4,951. And if we assume occupation up to maybe 80% of the architecture, that would give us a population just below 8,000 people. When my students came back and reported to me this data, I can honestly say that my jaw dropped. Archaeological population estimates being what they are, I expected there to be an incredibly wide range of variation and it probably not to be that useful. But you'll note that the mean between these two numbers is very close to the report that we get from a Franciscan friar in 1622, who tells us that he baptized a curiously precise number of people, 6,566 people here. And so I use this as kind of a middle range data, and I think that he probably is giving us a pretty accurate count on the number of people that were there in the 1620s. So now we can use that number, that range, to say that we know that there are around 6,500 people living in the Jemez Valley around the time of European contact, and that number plummets to 900 or less over the course of the first century of colonization. So this represents a population loss of 87% of the Jemez population, which is absolutely staggering if you consider, almost 9 out of 10 people dying in a very short period of time. And so we should just consider the huge effects that this would have had on these people, it's just a testament to their perseverance that they are still in existence today after suffering this kind of radical depopulation. I actually do think that the Jemez Pueblos were impacted even more severely than some other Pueblo groups in the Southwest. So we know that we have this huge population decline, but another thing we wanted to get at in this data was the timing of this decline. Was it a slow and steady decline from the point of early contact? Was it punctuated with large declines early on, tapering out later? And so for that, we look to the tree ring record. This is work done by my colleagues at the University of Arizona. And we went out to study the remains of trees that were growing on these archaeological sites. So usually when archaeologists use dendrochronology, we're often looking at the outer rings of our samples because we're usually interested in the cutting dates to date architecture. But for this project, we decided instead to look to the interior rings of these samples to look at the dates when trees established on these sites. And that's again because the data seems to indicate that the trees were denuded when people were living there. And it's only after these sites are vacated and people are no longer living there permanently that we start to get the regrowth of forests around these sites. Incidentally, we used ponderosa pine trees for this, and they also have this nifty trick of recording fire scars. So they record when forest fires move through the area as well. So we're also able to track changes in the fire ecology that's occurring throughout this period. And I'll come back to that point in just a minute. So what we did is we went out to these 18 sites and sampled trees all around these sites. And what you see on these maps, each of these triangles represents a different tree that we sampled. And we focused on trees that were within 100 meters of the architecture. Sampling the tree to look at the establishment date of that tree to try and see when these were still growing. Southwest is a very arid climate. So we're lucky that wood actually preserves, even laying on the ground for sometimes hundreds of years. We found in this study trees dating back to the 14th century that are still laying on the ground out there, not immediately at these sites, but in areas that were off of these sites. So we know that it's possible to have preservation of wood going back for centuries. And what we found was that we did not see trees establishing at these sites in the 1500s at all. We didn't find any trees establishing. I mentioned we have initial colonization in 1598, so none in the first decade of the 1600s, none in the second decade of the 1600s. It's not until the 1630s that we got the first recruitment of trees in large numbers, and then we get them in the 1640s and 1650s. So what this is telling us is that these sites were occupied up until the 1630s, and it's during that time that people are leaving these sites in large numbers. Again, we're also able to record the patterns of fire that occur during this period as well. And so what we end up seeing is that this is a record of forest fires, widespread fires throughout the region. What you see is in pre-contact times on the left side of this scale here, we see an average of a landscape scale for the fire event about once every 25 years. Once every 50 years. After Spanish colonization, we see that interval shorten to about once every 11 years. And so what is happening here? Well, what we think is happening is, again, the area is largely denuded when people are living in large numbers at these sites. As populations decrease, the fields that they were farming start to regrow with trees. This starts to fill in the forest canopy. And after Spanish colonialism, we get a forest that is much more, it fills in the areas and allows fire to spread much more easily. So when we combine the population data set with the fire data set, we see significant changes, not in the 1520s, which was the theory of some of the high counters. They'd expect to see population drops immediately after the siege of Tenochtitlan by Cortez if waves of disease were spreading out from there. We don't see it at first contact in 1539. We don't see a huge population drop even in 1598 with initial colonial occupation. We see the first big drops beginning in the 1630s. More than 100 years after, or around 100 years after initial contact with Europeans. So this leaves us with two questions. Why did this population crash occur when it did? And what did this decimation mean to the Pueblo people? How did they make sense of it? Well, what happens in the 1630s is we have an expansion of the Franciscan Catholic missionary effort in the Southwest at that time. So we see the large-scale establishment and expansion of mission facilities, and we see similar patterns of widespread depopulation at other Pueblo villages around the same time. Suzanne Eckert did a study of the Zuni village of Hawaku, where the mission was established in 1629, and she used bioarchaeological data to come to similar conclusions. So Eleanor Barrett also did a landscape study in the Southwest and came to similar conclusions about the Franciscan missionary effort. So the question is, what is it about the missions that leads to this depopulation? These missions were staffed by usually one Franciscan at most. So we know that in the Jemez Valley, there was one Franciscan stationed at the mission at any given time. So unless this missionary staggered into the valley harboring an active case of smallpox, it's unlikely that this one person would be the vector for the disease that would spread throughout all of these villages. Now, one thought we had early on was maybe it was the animals that were brought, domesticated animals that were acting as the vectors for disease. But when we look at the faunal record from this early colonial period, we do not see large numbers, almost any numbers of domesticated animals moving into the Jemez Valley really until the 18th century. Instead, based on this data, I no longer think it's as simple as just exposing Pueblo people to new germs. Otherwise, we would expect to see a population decline earlier. Rather, what I think is happening here is population decline occurs when it does, not because of exposure exclusively to new disease, but because of colonialism. Colonialism introduces resource stress, malnutrition, and starvation, which in turn made Pueblo peoples more susceptible to disease. This is what my colleague Paul Farmer has called conditions of structural violence. So within a few years, the Spaniards managed to subvert the subsistence economy. They colonized in 1598, and the Spaniards are dependent on the Pueblos for food. But we know that by the early years of the 1600s, the Pueblos are dependent on the Spaniards for food. Pueblo women are reported to have regularly followed Spanish carts in which tribute maize was transported in hopes of scavenging any stray cobs that might fall off. And the resulting nutritional stress probably made Pueblo peoples particularly vulnerable to disease. We also have this combined with colonial violence, forced relocation, and both virtual and literal enslavement of indigenous peoples throughout the Southwest at this time. Now, how did the Pueblos look at this disease? Well, they seem to have blamed a malevolent spirit that they called the Kliwa, which would translate as something like the refuse wind. And so this is where I drew the title for this talk, the reference to the refuse wind. So they don't seem to have blamed the Europeans that were newly in their midst. The Pueblo people had dealt with disease before, and they did not see this as something categorically new. And apparently they didn't associate it specifically with Europeans either. I would argue that in the same way, the modern tales that scholars have told about disease among Native Americans have separated the actions of settler colonists from the spread of disease. So many of you are probably familiar with Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. And this is a book that really popularized the notion that Native American depopulation was a natural event due to particularities of geography and genes. And what this does is it shifts the blame off of settler colonialism and onto microbes and genes, and creates a historical buffer between the horrors of the contact period and the present day, where health disparities continue to haunt Native American reservations. So what this argument does is it makes the contact period seem like a one-time, unique occurrence. And after doing this research, I no longer ascribe to the notion that Jemez people suffered such drastic population losses because they were destined to be decimated by germs. The timing of depopulation coming nearly 100 years after their first contact with settler colonists suggests that Native Americans were not born vulnerable, they were made vulnerable by malnutrition, by poverty, by warfare, and by dislocation. The introduction of disease may have been unavoidable. I'm not arguing that smallpox would never have affected Native American populations. What I'm arguing is that the consequences of the introduction of those diseases were not unavoidable. History shows us that other populations suffered devastating declines due to epidemics, but their populations typically recovered. So Athens suffers a plague in 430 BC. Rome has smallpox epidemics in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Medieval Europe, of course, has the bubonic plague, but all these populations recovered in ways that Native Americans have still not been able to accomplish more than 500 years after the fact. So the questions we should be asking maybe is not how many Native Americans died, but why weren't their populations able to recover? And not how many Native Americans died in the early days of settler colonialism, but why have Native Americans always died at higher rates than Europeans and Euro-Americans from 1492 down to the present day? The historical narratives that we tell really inform how we think about Native health and inequality in the 21st century. And by naturalizing Native American susceptibility to disease as an inevitable consequence of genetics, we create an aura of inevitability. So for indigenous peoples living under colonial regimes, health disparities are a persistent fact of life, whether we're talking about smallpox, measles, and typhus in the 17th and 18th centuries, tuberculosis in the 19th and 20th centuries, or COVID-19 in the 21st. Today, indigenous communities suffer deaths due to diabetes at more than 3 times the rate of other Americans, cardiovascular disease twice the rate of the rest of the nation, and infant mortality rates double that the rest of the US population. In the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, and again in the 2009 outbreak of swine flu, also known as H1N1, the death rate for indigenous groups who contracted these diseases was 4 times that of all other racial and ethnic groups combined. And so tragically and unsurprisingly, indigenous communities have been hit particularly hard by the novel coronavirus pandemic over the past year. In New Mexico, where Native Americans comprise 11% of the state's population, indigenous persons accounted for 57% of the state's COVID-19 cases in May 2020. And the Pueblos of Zia and San Felipe reported some of the highest community infection rates in the country at 3.4 and 2.3% respectively. And those rates exceeded that of New York City at the height of the spring 2020 pandemic. And so I'll conclude today by stating what I hope this presentation has made obvious, that this is not a natural or inevitable situation. And these statistics should cause us to reflect on how indigenous peoples came to be more susceptible to COVID-19 than settler colonial populations. The novel coronavirus pandemic sheds new light on a terrible truth, that the horrors of 17th century epidemics among indigenous peoples were not a unique one-time accident of history. And I'd encourage all of us to think about how archaeologists can dismantle the enduring myths that contribute and continue to be used to rationalize health inequalities among indigenous and Black peoples around the world today, and how we can contribute to processes, resources, and agendas that challenge this system. How we think about the earliest days of colonial settlement in the Americas structures how we think about indigenous health disparities today. Thanks so much for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions that folks might have.
Professor Liebmann, thank you so much for such a powerful and strong talk. And then let me just unshare. We open now the session, the Q&A session, and can please.
I'm going to stop my share. So
Yeah. Thank you so much. And if anyone has a question, can you please just raise your hand? And if you want me just to read your question, please use the chat. Any questions? Oh yes, it's a very the command that if the Sheffield, yes, it would be great. I agree with you totally and completely. Paul, yes, please.
Thanks, Matt. Fantastic presentation as ever.
Thank you.
I just got a question, not really knowing the data from this area, and it's really less about your talk, but more about what happens next, and whether or not there is any evidence, for example, after this very significant population collapse and increased vulnerability of the Native American populations, that there was also a collapse, if you like, of the farming knowledge, and I use knowledge rather than system. Is there, for example, a loss of knowledge of the benefits of intercropping, the benefits of sort of a multi-crop sort of diet, and that these, this loss of knowledge and loss of diversity itself also contributes to increased sort of susceptibility to disease?
That's a great question, Paul, and one that I hadn't really considered previously. I guess I would speculate a couple of things. First, we don't have great data from immediately after this period, because beginning in the 18th century, the Pueblos were mainly relocated to the areas that they are today. So they're living on top of the data that would get us from the end of this study down to the present. But there was additional pressure in that they were taxed incredibly heavily by the Spaniards, largely in terms of their agricultural production. So at the same time, there's still pressure on the people who are there to maintain their agricultural systems. And the records that we do have through the 17th century indicate that although the population gets smaller, they're still very intensively farming at that time all the way through the 17th century. And in fact, with the introduction of the mission sites, they start to adapt irrigation agriculture rather than the dry farming that they had used prior to that time, although they're still using dry farming through that period as well. So certainly I'm sure there was a loss of knowledge during that time. Anytime you have 90% of your population wiped out within a period of, really, it comes down to a 40 to 50 year period that they had that massive population loss. You have to imagine that there's going to be loss of critical knowledge. But in the agricultural realm, they seem to have maintained some productivity through that time. And certainly today, there's a huge amount of agricultural productivity there that's an ongoing source of pride for Pueblo people.
Thank you. Can I just follow up? Is there a continuation in terms of the diversity of the crops being cultivated? Partly what I was thinking is that if there is a pressure to produce staples to supply wider markets, and particularly the Spanish, there's less sort of opportunity and engagement on the subsidiary crops. Yet actually, many studies seem to show that including the subsidiary crops both, maintains a more fertile and more productive soil biome, but also that diversity of dietary intake acts against. I'm thinking of some studies I can't now recall from Mexico, where the collapse of that, or the change from the classic La Milpa system to others, has some people have tried to link to increased cardiovascular disease and diabetes in contemporary Mexican populations. So that was the way I was thinking.
It's a great question, and one that I'm going to have to try to look more into. I mean, the other complication is that at the same time, you have the introduction, of course, of the old world crops at this time too. So what we see produced today among the Pueblos is an amalgam, right? So things like tomatoes and watermelons, even chili peppers, which is really a staple of Pueblo diet, although a new world crop, it's introduced as a result of Spanish colonization. So the Spaniards bring it up from Mexico, and the Pueblos start producing it only in the 17th century. So in the mid 17th century, you have the introduction of all kinds of different, lots of fruits, but also, of course, melons, the chilies, wheat. There's some experiments with wheat, although that doesn't seem to go very well. But it's a good question about how the traditional crop systems might have changed during this time. And so one that I'll have to put my thinking cap on and try to get some good data to answer that. Thanks for raising it.
Thanks, Matt.
John, do you want to ask your question? I know was partially answered, but still, do you want to ask?
Oh, okay. Thanks for a really interesting seminar. I really enjoyed that. I was wondering if the population decline happened as a result of basically the Pueblo not being able to be self-sufficient and starting to suffer inequality. What caused that if they weren't yet impacted? Was that due to colonialism like taxation or labor co-optation or something like that, or actual violence, or what was behind that loss of self-sufficiency?
Yeah, I'd say all the above. I mean, really immediately what happened was the Spaniards seized the stores of surplus corn that the Pueblos had, and they're pretty explicit about this in showing this inversion of the subsistence economy. And so the missions really become storehouses and places to redistribute food among the Pueblos. At the same time, they introduce the Encomienda system, which is this system of forced labor on the Pueblos that's pulling Pueblo men out of the fields at the time when they need to be there most, at the harvest time, because they're being forced to work for the Spaniards. They're also taxed in the forms of animal hides, and so men are forced to go out and hunt more as well, and probably women producing hides more as well. So it's the overall, but everything you mentioned, John. So there's violence. We have, there's a famous incident at the Pueblo of Acoma where, after a resistance to some initial colonization efforts there, they order the foot of every adult male over the age of 25 to be cut off. So you can imagine how that would just cripple the economic base of that community when all of their adult males are unable to work in the fields anymore. It's just, I think, all of the above. It's one piled on top of another. And we also have some other factors outside of colonialism. At the same time, we know that there's a pretty significant drought in the early decades of the 17th century, another one in the late 17th century that would have put additional stresses on the system, as well as I mentioned, forced labor, heavy taxation, just all the above. So.
The next question is from Paloma. Paloma, maybe it's better for you to unmute yourself and ask the question your own.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, Matthew, for this wonderful talk. I have a question. I was wondering, listening to you, if in the archaeological record, you can pinpoint things like the leyes nuevas proposed by Felipe II in the late, I think, 16th century, or things like that, because I was really impressed of the resolution of the archaeology, obviously.
Yeah, we're lucky to have the Triering data and a really tight chronology. We don't have, there's nothing I can point to in terms of shifts in Spanish colonial policy that are directly implicated in the archaeological record, with one exception. We are told that the Spaniards initially implement taxation on a household basis. So they're literally going to the doors of each of the houses and taxing people that. And the Pueblos figure this out pretty quickly. So what they start doing is moving more people into their household to lessen the tax burden, right? And so we actually see room sizes expand after colonization. Now, the floor area per person, we think, remains consistent through there, important for this study. But the room size gets big beginning in the mid 17th century, much bigger than it had been in pre-contact times. And I believe that's because the Pueblos are responding to the ways in which they're being taxed. And the Spaniards figure that out. They're writing to each other about this, saying, like, their houses are getting bigger, they're moving more people in there, this isn't working, we need to change up how we're levying the taxes on them. So it's a great question.
Thank you.
There is a question from Graham, and maybe it's better for you to unmute yourself and ask, if you don't mind.
Yeah, it was a fabulous paper again, I thought. I mentioned I was at Discussant a couple of days ago. There was a session organised by Alison Damick and others called Risky Business. It was about risk and resilience in arid landscapes. And she gave a paper where she was talking about charcoal work she's been doing at sites north of Santa Fe. And she talked about how, and she was showing how difficult it was to distinguish lightning fires from anthropogenic fires, and she was talking about how one can try to do that. And I just wondered if that was an issue with your tree ring stuff. And actually, I was reminded, having written that, there was another paper also in the same sort of area where you're working by Emily Dawson and Heather Trigg. It was called something like Risk and Resilience on the Spanish Colonial Frontier. And they were looking at late 16th century. And it was a combination. They were looking at Spanish records, plus also phytolith macro-botanical remains. And one of the thrusts of that she was getting across, if you like, was how incompetent the Spanish colonialists were at that time, broadly trying to use techniques they brought in, and suffering incredibly from the cold, and actually in the end, starting to take much more seriously, if you like, the agricultural systems of the Pueblo around them. Anyway, I just wonder if you had comments on either of those.
Yeah, thank you. Certainly. I mean, things like trying to introduce wheat and the amount of water that it takes to keep a wheat crop going, it doesn't work well in New Mexico. And I love Heather's work, and so I'll have to contact her to get a copy of that. So as far as the lightning fires versus anthropogenic fires, so probably most of the fires that we're recording are lightning strike fires. This is a region that receives like the second most number of lightning strikes in the United States every year. The pre-contact fires that we see almost certainly were lightning strike fires, and our speculation is you can see a difference in that the anthropogenic fires are very low intensity ground fires that they're using to clear some very light undergrowth after the initial clearing of those. And the lightning-based landscape level fires are connecting up some other patches of trees. We can see a huge spike in the number of fires when the population of this region initially takes off, which is right around 1200 here. So it's post-Chaco, people move north and then move down here. And so we pick that up in some of the geoarchaeology. My colleague Chris Rose at SMU picks up the charcoal in the soils, and we see a huge uptick in the 1100s and early 1200s. So those we think are the anthropogenic fires where they're clearing the landscape. Unfortunately, the scars on the Ponderosa pines don't tell us what kind of fire it was, but the way we try to get at that question is we look at when we see scars occurring in the same year on trees that are widely spaced, and I'm talking about over hundreds of meters, kilometers here, then we can start to say, okay, fire in the same year at all these different locations indicates probably a landscape level fire, and that's probably a lightning strike fire, versus the kind of burning for fields that Pueblo people do tends to be these smaller anthropogenic ones. But there is some equifinality there. It's a little bit hard to dissimulate between the two. Thanks.
Any other questions, comments from the audience? Yeah, one. Federica, can you just please probably unmute yourself and ask a question?
Yes, thank you very much. Terrific and very inspiring. Can you say anything about potential relationship between depopulation trends and topography as you move across the Rio Grande catchment?
Oh, and topography? Was that the? Yeah.
Topography, altitude, because you have quite distinctive gradient.
Yeah, and I've talked about this with some colleagues. So there are differences, but the patterns we have not fully figured out. So some of the pueblos that are hardest hit are the ones that live at lower elevations south of this area, also right along the Rio Grande. but also those are that's the first area the Spaniards would come to as they come up from Mexico. And so there may have been tighter colonial control and increased Spanish settlement around in the vicinity around those pueblos. So it doesn't seem to be based, exclusively on elevation, although to be quite honest, we could use better data from some of the other regions around the Southwest. But the topography is integral to why the Spaniards settle where they do, when they do. And so in the Jemez Valley, they pull the Jemez off the mesa tops and down into that one central village where they are now. And that probably also helped to contribute once disease had been introduced, of course. As you're aggregating populations, that's going to contribute to the spread of infectious diseases among people. So the fact that the Spaniards, this may have been one of the buffer effects that would have helped to protect the Jemez in those early decades of initial contact and colonization. They're living in this really rugged territory on the mountaintops. Spaniards complain, the missionaries complain all the time that these people live in such a rugged area, we can't effectively minister to them. And so it was only when they pulled them down into the valley bottoms again, once they had really commandeered the market on the food sources so that they could get the people to come to the missions, that you see that shift. So if I had to speculate without having the hard data, I'd say people, not so much in terms of raw altitude, but just the ruggedness of the territory might have helped to buffer people. And the really interesting story here is what happens among the Navajo at the same time. So the Navajo are the hunter, gatherer, forager neighbors of the Pueblos that at this time are kind of living around the edges of the Pueblo world. And we don't have great data on this, but we can see that in the 18th century, Navajo populations are going up while everybody else's populations are going down. Now, the Navajo are never colonized and missionized in quite the same ways that the Pueblos were, and they're also adapting large-scale domesticated animals. So they shift to herding and sheep husbandry at that time, and that probably plays a role. But it appears that they didn't suffer the same drastic declines in population that the Pueblos did, because they're more dispersed, they're out of way, they're not under the thumb of the Spaniards, and they're able to kind of harness these new nutritional resources at that time in the form of sheep. But I mean, it's maybe not an earth-shattering news to say the ones who get colonized suffer the worst, and the ones who are, as I'm sure Stephen Acabado talked about with you guys last week, the paracolonial people are a little bit buffered from the immediate impacts of colonialism. Not to say they weren't affected later and pretty drastically, but in the 18th and even into the 19th century, Navajo populations seem to be increasing while everyone else's are decreasing.
Thank you. If there isn't any other question, can I just quickly follow up? Because I was also thinking about sensitivity to droughts and what you find in sort of in the earlier period. I think Scott Ingram did some nice work about how altitudinal range might have affected sensitivity to droughts. And connected to that, I was also wondering whether as you go up in the Four Corners, Mesa Verde area, you have perhaps environmental settings that is so complex that might enable you to recover in a different way through shocks, but I don't know, as opposed to the bottom valley of the Rio Grande.
So the question of resilience is really an important one. I mean, what we're seeing is the people in the Rio Grande and the periods that I'm talking about are the people from Mesa Verde who migrate down after that. Sorry, I lost my track of thought there. The first part of the question was, remind me again.
Sensitivity to droughts.
Right.
Between the valley and the.
So I'm gonna offend all of my Southwesternist colleagues and put us into two big camps when it comes to drought, right? So there are the people in the Southwest who see drought as a major mover of social change throughout time. And it's true, we can look at some important moments of Pueblo history and they line up pretty clearly with some droughts, most specifically the late 12th century drought that's aligned with the abandonment of Chaco. But there's another camp that says that droughts are really common in desert climates, and these people knew how to survive and adapt to drought. And in fact, this is why the Spaniards are able to gather all these food resources when they come. The Pueblos have a practice of storing 7 years of crop in order to buffer them against times of drought or lower agricultural production. So at least, you know, by the late 1500s, it seems that they've come up with a pretty good system to help buffer some of the more significant effects of drought. That gets totally disrupted by the Spaniards when they seize those stores of food. But I think the fact that that system that they had gets disrupted makes it clear that when the droughts do then hit, it has some pretty substantial impacts. And there's a massive drought in the first decade of the 17th century and another huge drought in the late 1660s, early 1670s. And some people have drawn a connection between that and the uprising in 1680, the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, when they expel the Spaniards, because they're just stretched so thin that they reach the breaking point there. I wrote a book on the Pueblo Revolt. There's a whole lot of other causes to the Pueblo Revolt too. I would never, ever, ever break it down to just rainfall, because I think that was probably lesser than some of the colonial impacts. But certainly drought is a factor, and I think the systems that they had for dealing with the impacts of those were severely impacted by colonialism in the 17th century.
Thank you very much.
The question from Graeme Barker: are the skeletal data there to test the pre-disease vulnerability diet stress argument?
So, of course, we're working in the context of NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. A lot of that data is not accessible anymore. In fact, so I work with Jemez Pueblo, and they are the descendants of people who lived at Pecos Pueblo, which some of you may recognize, a famous site in American archaeology excavated by A.B. Kidder, and also the site of the single largest repatriation effort by Jemez Pueblo, when they repatriated more than 2,000 remains from Pecos, from the institution that currently employs me, Harvard University, right? So, there was a data set there that these could be explored. It's currently not accessible. I would point to some of that work that I mentioned by Suzanne Eckert among the Zuni, although the specific focus on resource stress and compared in a pre and post contact baseline, I don't have any great information on that. What's clear from the skeletal record is it was not a disease-free paradise prior to Spanish colonization. And of course, the diseases, the kinds of infectious diseases that we're talking about here don't leave a signature in the skeletal record, but the resource stresses should. And actually, I'm remembering some studies here that do address it. So Kate Spielman did studies on some of the bioarchaeology of the Salinas Pueblos, and they can see increased labor demands. So increased grinding and hide production among women and carrying of burdens, and some decreases in or nutritional stresses that occur at that time as well. So she has a great article she published in 2009 with a bunch of her colleagues that I'm blanking on the title, but I think it was in Journal of Archaeological Research. Anyway, Kate Spielman has some data on that for those that are interested.
Thank you very much. Any further questions? Any comments, probably? Then thank you very much, Professor Liebmann, for your fantastic, absolutely fantastic
talk.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who participated in our today's seminar, and hope to see you next week. Have a nice weekend, everybody.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.